back good news of short-term mission trips. And through the video, we could only share a little bit about our experience there. And so I would encourage you, if you have any more questions and want to hear more good news of what God is doing in Cambodia, to come talk to me or Dorothy and ask us, what is God doing there? In the video, there was a section in which, in the beginning, when we talked about a little bit about the history, and this is the mid-70s, so within the lifetime of most of us gathered here. In the 70s, a man named Pol Pot and his political party called the Khmer Rouge were coming into the city. And the city, when they were literally walking in, and there's a picture of it above, as they were parading in, the city exploded with excitement and anticipation. Why? Because the country had been a battleground between other countries, among other countries that were fighting each other because of political ideologies, whether democratic or communist or whatever. They were fighting, and Cambodia in the early 70s became a battleground in that fight. And so when the Khmer Rouge, which was a political party that rose out of the people, came into town to take over Phnom Penh, the capital city, the people were excited because they were tired of being stepped on. They were tired of having their own land be the battleground for the world. And so they were, as the people were coming, they were excited and anticipatory of the great rescue that their own people would start. They began to ask, who are these people? And they believed that the Khmer Rouge were coming to rescue them from foreign control and domination. The problem was, of course, that the Khmer Rouge were not coming to rescue them necessarily as the people had thought. But their arrival was the beginning of a campaign of terror that led to the killings of millions of Cambodians by their own country people. And it's the subject of the classic movie, The Killing Fields. And I don't know if you guys remember, it came out in the 80s, right? Really good movie. Today is Palm Sunday, the day on which we commemorate, we remember, we read scripture around the story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And this day leads into this week that leads to Easter, and we call this week Holy Week. And we will see in our passage for today that, like the Khmer Rouge, Jesus had his own party. He had his own group of people, and together they were entering into the city. And his entry into the city began to cause a stir among the people, such that they were asking, what's going on? And in our Bible passage, it'll even say that the whole city was in turmoil. But unlike the Khmer Rouge, when Jesus entered the city, he came to save, not by the death of his beloved, but by his own death. And by his own death, he began the process of rescue, of real rescue from sin and from death. So let's read our passage today. And it comes from Matthew chapter 21, and we'll be reading through from verse 1 to 11. Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. When they had come near Jerusalem and reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When he had entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" the crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." As we remember Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem, I'd like for us to kind of glean from this story three things, three thoughts. And because, this is a story that is familiar with all of us. If you've grown up in the church, you've read this a million times, it feels like, right? It's a story that we're familiar with. But I'd like for us to think about three things as we enter, as today is Palm Sunday, and as we enter into Holy Week. First thing I'd like for us to think about and see in this passage is that when Jesus goes to the city, things get stirred. Things get stirred up. Things start to move. The passage says that when Jesus entered the city, that the city was in turmoil, right? It says that the city was in turmoil. Now, many of us think of the word turmoil as in ruckus, as in this big, it's not a good term, right? Turmoil. But one of the things that I'd like to clue us into is this, that the word turmoil, the English word turmoil, as you know, our English translation is translated from a Greek manuscript, right? And in the Greek that was translated into turmoil, the word connotes shaking, and that's actually where we get our modern day words seismic, or right, for earthquake, seismic activity, because it comes from the Greek word seism. And so it's been translated to turmoil, and only to connote the idea and convey the idea that there is this intense thing that's happening, such that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew would use the word turmoil, the shaking of the ground. But in this instance, it wasn't the shaking of the ground that was happening, but it was the whole city. The people were shaking as Jesus was entering into the city. Why? Because when Jesus enters a place to accomplish something, it causes the people to stir. It causes things to happen. And in our passage, what we see is that when Jesus goes to the city, things get stirred up. One way we can think about the city is that the city is a metaphor for any place that Jesus wants to be to do a work. So when we think about it in that way, because Jesus entered Jerusalem for a work, why? He was going to go to the cross for us. In the same way, when we think about how Jesus enters a place, think about your own life. Whenever Jesus enters into our lives, a place in our lives, whether it be a literal place like our workplace, or figurative, our workplace environment, or our schools, or even our families and our friendships and our relationships, guess what? It causes a stir. When Jesus comes into the places of our lives, it causes a stir. Why? Because Jesus wants to be there, and he wants to do a work wherever he is. If the places in our lives seem a little dull, seem like they can use a little bit of Jesus stirring things up, it's probably not because Jesus doesn't want to be there, but it's probably because we are cutting off the pathway for Jesus to enter those places. And so we need to ask in our lives, lives, and as we reflect upon our lives this week, we have to ask ourselves, where in our lives do we need Jesus to stir things up? Where in our lives do we need Jesus to revive a few things? And we need to ask ourselves in the same breath, am I cutting off Jesus from coming into those places in which I want Jesus to work? Because I find myself in my life, Jesus, why can't you work in this place in my life? Only to realize that I am probably cutting him off from entering those places. Where in your life do you need Jesus to stir things up a little bit, to do a work? And are you cutting the path off? When Jesus goes to the city, things get stirred up. The second thing that I notice in this passage is that when Jesus works, when Jesus goes to the city and then he begins to work, people ask, people wonder, people notice. In this passage, the city, when Jesus went into the city asked what? Who is this? Who is this? And it occurred to me that whenever Jesus comes into a place and begins to work, people begin to notice things. They might not know what it is, who it is, why it is, but something is in the air where they begin to notice something. And that's part of what we do in missions. We follow Jesus into places like Cambodia, not to